Hello everyone, Jack here from Disseminate and welcome to another of our cutting edge episodes. The topic of discussion today will be sustainable computing. Specifically, we'll be talking to Tammy Sukprasert, who will be telling us about her recent work on the limitations of carbon-aware temporal and spatial workload shifting in the cloud, which was recently published at Eurosys 2024. Tammy is a PhD student in the Sustainable Computing Lab at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where her research interests are systems software. Welcome to the show, Tammy.
Thanks for having me.
The pleasure's all ours. Let's get started then. So it's customary on the podcast. Obviously, I give you the very high level overview there, the highlight reel of who you are. But tell us more about yourself in your own words. And what got you interested in this area of research in the first place?
Hi, everyone. I'm Tammy. I'm a second-year PhD student at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. I'm currently doing a second year of my PhD, but during my undergrad studies, part of it was during the pandemic, and it was challenging to just wake up and join a Zoom call because it was like really boring. But there was one lecture that it was not too bad to join in the morning, and as you may guess, it's a systems lecture. Yeah, it was interesting to learn how system software makes computer hardware solve complex problems and serve different purposes. So when I was about to do a PhD, I was like, yeah, maybe this is something I could do. So yeah, and here I am talking to Jack.
Awesome stuff. I mean, it must have been really hard doing your undergrad during the pandemic. I mean, I found it hard enough to go to lectures anyway when I was doing my undergraduate. So if it was online and I could watch it, I'd always convince myself, I'll watch it later on. But yeah, I don't know. That never really happened in reality. Cool. Did you always know, Tammy, from sort of kind of a young age that the PhD was the end goal, or was it something that you discovered as part of your studies and thought, maybe PhD would be something that I'd want to pursue?
Yeah, so during the pandemic, that was when I decided maybe PhD is something I could do. I was fortunate enough to be offered some position in the lab as an undergrad, and there's a systems lab actually. So it was like, oh yeah, I mean, I went in not knowing anything, but came out actually deciding to do a grad school. So pretty interesting opportunity.
Well, let's talk about your research then. So before we do that, though, let's set some background for the chat today. Then let's set some context. So we're talking about sustainable computing and this sort of idea of being carbon aware and being kind of tech companies being aware of their carbon footprint. So maybe you can kind of start us off by telling us why there is a focus on this. Why do we need to reduce our carbon footprint? And then we can maybe dig into a little bit more kind of the rationale behind being able to shift workloads around. So yeah, set us some background, Tammy.
All right. Ready to take the ride? Okay. So to understand why we have like this focus on computing's carbon footprint, we need to first understand that there is an increase in computing demand. And in fact, it's increasing like at a rapidly accelerating rate. And part of the reason why is the rise of artificial intelligence. Like, everyone knows like ChatGPT, right? So research has consistently shown that, and I can give you one of the name is the Epic AI, that the training compute has grown by a factor of, in fact, like 10 billion since 2010. That's a lot.
That's a big number.
Like, a lot of zeros. Yeah, a lot of zeros. So, so the amount of computing is growing, right? And that what that means is that the electricity of consumption of data centers is also increasing at a rapidly accelerating rate as well. So currently, just to set the context here, data centers consume about 3% of world electricity. So that's a lot. And it is projected to increase in the future because you need more data storage and processing in data centers. So it makes sense, right? So to break it down, in the US, it's projected to increase from 200 terawatt hour in 2022 to 260 terawatt hour in 2026. So that's like 30% increase of data center energy consumption. And in Europe, in 2022, the data center energy consumption is about 100 terawatt hour. But in 2026, it is projected to be about 150 terawatt hour for data center consumption. So that's like 50%. So that's a crazy increase in energy consumption. So although there's an increasing energy efficiency in hardware, the demand of energy consumption still outpaced the energy efficiency. So moving forward, the cloud exponential growth will translate more directly into the rise in energy demand, right?
Yeah.
So this makes data center to be one of the primary contributors of the global carbon emissions. So now the energy efficiency is reaching like the bottleneck. So instead of focusing on just reducing energy consumption, you need to now also look at the carbon footprint of using side. So because in the end of the day, what is the real matter here is the issue of climate change.
Yeah. So let's shift it on now to, so we know this is a problem. So we want to reduce our carbon footprint. For, I mean, 3% of the total energy consumption of the globe is a big number. But yeah, of course, we want to sort of mitigate against this problem because we want the planet to keep. We don't want to ruin the planet, right? So we need to sort of be aware of climate change stuff, and we need to tackle this problem. And tech is aware of it. So where does the temporal and spatial workload shifting aspects of it come into this then? So can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so it is interesting how computing has many dimensions of flexibility. So it allows people to decide when, how quickly, and where to compute. So in reducing computing's carbon footprint, we want to shift the workload to the time period or location with low carbon intensity, right? So simple. And that's the nice part because most computing workload has that temporal and spatial flexibility. For example, the batch machine learning training jobs have a substantial temporal flexibility that enable workloads to be suspended during the high carbon period, and you can resume the workload during the low carbon period. And another example is the interactive inference requests for object detection, which may have spatial flexibility that enable the requests to be migrated and served at the location with low carbon intensity.
Nice, Tammy. So when you say carbon intensity, what do you mean by that exactly?
Yeah, so different energy sources like coal, solar, wind has different emission factor. So let's say 50% of your electricity is from coal and 50%, another 50% is from solar, right? So it's just a weighted average from those two sources.
Okay, cool, nice. So given this demand, we know the demand's high, we want to solve that problem. We've got this like really nice property of computing that workloads of flexibility that we can shift them with respect to time and with respect to space, depending on the type of workload we want to do. Where does your paper fit into this then? So what is the elevator pitch for your research, I guess, Tammy?
Sure. So given all the discussion about how workload can be shifted across time and location, right? So it is important to understand the potential of carbon reductions from the temporal and spatial workload shifting, and also sometimes referred to as spatial temporal workload shifting. So the goal of this paper is to quantify the upper limit of carbon reductions from the spatial temporal workload shifting for different workload characteristics. And the diversity in workload characteristics matters because we want to help the research community understand where we are today and where we should focus on to achieve substantial impact on carbon reduction.
Nice. Yeah, I love the word spatiotemporal. It sounds cool. I always think
That's could be a tongue twister sometimes.
a little bit,
yeah.
but if you nail it, it sounds cool, right? You go, oh yeah, I'm doing some spatiotemporal analysis. People look at you like, wow, okay, yeah, yeah. Cool, right. Anyway, let's talk about this study you performed then. So can you give us the overview of the study, I guess, then, and just tell us more about the analysis you performed?
Yeah, sure. So to understand the upper limits of spatiotemporal workload shifting, we use a carbon trace data set that includes 103 regions worldwide from Electricity Maps Web API. Each region's data has an hourly carbon intensity over 3 years. So 2020 to 2022. So that's where the analysis is like the data set that we use for the analysis. And the analysis is grouped into four main categories. So global carbon analysis, spatial migration, temporal shifting, and lastly, a what if scenario. In the global carbon analysis, we look into magnitude and variation of the carbon intensity across 123 regions. In spatial migration, we quantify how much carbon reduction is possible from spatially migrating the workloads. and how the capacity and latency constraints impact the carbon reductions. On top of that, we also look into the workload migration policies. For temporal shifting, we quantify how much carbon reduction is possible from temporally shifting a delay tolerant batch workloads and how much the carbon reduction varies with different workload characteristics. So like the job length and how much delay we can put in for different scenarios. And in the final part of the analysis, we look into some what if scenarios. And in this case, like the main one is what happened when a region becomes greener.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I mean that's kind of hopefully the goal for the whole world, right? We're going towards net zero, right? So hopefully all this is going to become greener. So, but we'll see how that actually plays out in practice. But awesome, cool. So there's these nice four sort of breakdowns here: the global level of space and the time, and then these what if scenarios. So what techniques did you actually use to sort of help construct this upper bound of the carbon reductions we can achieve? Yeah, what are the sort of techniques you used to analyze this data set?
Yeah, so to construct an upper bound on the carbon reductions, we modeled the compute in a very ideal setting. So we only include like key aspects like job length, some network latency, and data center capacity. So the fundamentals that may affect carbon emissions, right?
Mm.
But yeah, despite not being like a complete analysis, like, I mean, of course, in the real scenario, there's so many constraints you can put in, right? So we just focus on the fundamentals, and that's where, so yeah, so the ideal case, so we can quantify the upper bound. And for temporal and spatial workload scheduling, they require two different constructions of the upper bound scenarios. So in spatial migration, the scenario where workload can achieve the upper bound is when the workload itself can be migrated to anywhere in the world, and all the regions have data centers with infinite capacity, right? And on top of that, there's no data transfer overhead when migrating the workload. So basically, a you just place anywhere you want for the workload. And for temporal scheduling, the scenario in which the workload can achieve the upper bound is when the workload has a perfect knowledge of the future carbon intensity, in this case for the whole year. So with this level of flexibility, a specific job can choose the best time slot to run when doing the temporal shifting to achieve the lowest carbon emission in the region.
Nice, yeah. Like you say, I guess it's such a big space initially with all the constraints. You've kind of got to pick the important ones to sort of make sense of all the sort of, because otherwise, like you would never like get anything down on paper, right? If it was just kind of there's like thousands of different dimensions to it. So yeah, that's definitely it's definitely the way to approach this problem. Cool. So let's talk about the results then, like what the findings were. So what's the message? Like, can spatiotemporal workload shifting actually help us and sort of reduce our carbon footprint and save the environment?
Yeah, so the results, let's start with the global carbon analysis first to set the context here. So, right. So the result shows that an average carbon intensity across all 123 regions is 368 grams of carbon per kilowatt hour. So it doesn't make any sense yet, so bear with me. And then what happens is this is the carbon emission of a unit job. And to reduce the carbon emission through spatial migration, we want to migrate the workload to the lowest region. And in this case, in our data set is Sweden. And when migrating all the workload to Sweden, we reduce the carbon emissions of the whole world by 96%. And because every data center has an infinite capacity in this case. However, in our paper, we also have a constrained scenario where every data center has only 50% unused capacity. And with this scenario, we can only achieve the carbon reduction of the whole world by about 52%. For temporal shifting, the takeaway is that temporal shifting offers more benefits to short jobs in high variance regions. And the high variance regions include regions like those in Oceania. However, high variance regions are already low in carbon intensity. However, the regions with high emissions that could harness the benefit of temporal shifting has low variance, so they can't do much of temporal shifting. Also, as a region becomes greener, the average carbon intensity of the region decreases, causing the carbon agnostic scheduling to also yield lower emissions. So what this means is that as a region become greener, the benefits of carbon aware scheduling diminish as yeah.
So yeah, it's interesting that on the first that I mentioned of spatial, right? The kind of, I guess if everywhere's got infinite capacity, it makes sense to move to the place that has the lowest carbon intensity, which happens to be Sweden. So we're all moving to Sweden, right? We're all going to run our jobs in Sweden's data centers now, right? But I guess you said that in when you actually relax that or kind of introduce that constraint of it not having infinite capacity, the best you can do there is like 52%. How much does that map to actual, like, of all the world's compute versus how much capacity there is actually in Sweden? Like, I don't know how many data centers there are in Sweden. Like, is that even practical if we could do that? Like, is it like if we just then, okay, we're moving everything from EU West into Sweden now? Is that even possible?
No. So short answer is no. So data centers have need idle capacity for stability purposes. So in general, they need some level unused capacity, and in the sense that, so even we say like, yeah, everyone migrate to Sweden and we're done. In reality, you can't do that, or like you have to fill one capacity of the lowest data center and then move on to the second lowest. In reality, you can't do that.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. And on the temporal stuff, like, I guess it's sort of what's the phrase for it? But like the places that could benefit from it, I think that in your paper you mentioned, I think it was Mumbai maybe, about kind of one of these places that would benefit from being able to shift workloads around. But then the problem is the energy that's produced there is so carbon intensive, and there's such a low sort of variance in it that all the all the energy is actually produced by burning fossil fuels, right? So it's not actually any benefit whether you run it at midnight or at lunchtime. The energy is still coming from the nearest power station, right? So you're kind of a bit screwed on that front as well. And it's interesting that Oceania has the highest variance, and that was an interesting observation. On this magic number 368, the per unit job, per of 368 grams of carbon per unit job. How did you arrive at that number?
Yeah, so it's an average carbon intensity for all 123 regions in, I think, in year 2022.
Okay,
Yeah.
right,
So the
sure,
most recent one in our data, we just like sum them up, average it out.
yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. So I'm getting I'm getting the vibe here that spatiotemporal shifting isn't the silver bullet that we need it to be, right? So yeah, kind of, what is the take on it then? So is it going to save us spatiotemporal workload shifting, or is it not what we need it to be really?
So we still should do it, not like, oh, like after everyone listening to podcasts, everyone just drop what they're doing. Like, please don't do that. Like, it's still gonna work in theory, but it's not, yeah, of course, like what you said, it's not a silver bullet. You still need some other like aspects of computer system to harness to reduce carbon emissions, not just like one way. And I think it's just in general, like there's no one mega solution, but in like small groups of solutions working together. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I guess as well. I mean, you touched on it earlier on where you're talking about the sort of some of the practical constraints of that. It's all good and well if we do move to Sweden, right? All our compute there. But if I'm in Australia and I'm running an application that's latency sensitive, it's not good for my application, right, as well. And I guess there's other constraints like GDPR and sort of these sorts of constraints as well, which add to this complexity of optimizing for all these various constraints, and it kind of, I guess, limits this approach even more, right? I guess.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Cool. Is there any way we can, from the way we actually construct our jobs, is there anything we can do to make the jobs more amenable? There's a word. That's the word, I think. Amenable. To this approach, like, if we can kind of make our jobs more flexible with respect to time and have less big jobs and have more small jobs, could that help stuff as well if we kind of change the way people engage with cloud computing environments?
Yeah, I think we should. So if you want to harness like temporal shifting, you should make your job like smaller chunks. That's like the basis, right? Like basically you want to fit your job into like the low carbon period as much as you can. But at the same time, people also look into like dynamic voltage frequency scaling or DVFS. So there are multiple like outlets for this, not just like just shifting the workload like this paper.
Yeah. Is this something, Tammy, that the cloud providers are actually actively doing at the moment in internally in sort of are they obviously these tech companies are aware of trying to reduce their carbon footprint, but how much work are AWS, for example, actually doing on this front to shift computation around? Because kind of I guess at the moment my interactions with cloud environments when I want to run a job, I go on there and say, hey, give me a VM in I don't know US South or whatever, and then it'll run there, right? But like I'm very much sort of constraining it. So how much do they do stuff behind the scenes that I'm not aware of? I guess is what I'm asking.
So cloud providers, it's a little tricky for them, right? Because they have like deadline sensitive workloads that need to, you know, serve. So maybe that might not be something they can reduce carbon emissions at the moment, but I'm pretty sure they have like some non-urgent jobs that they can schedule during low carbon period. And that is like similar idea for like you can schedule your workload during the time where the electricity bill is cheaper. So yeah, so probably they probably look into something like that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it kind of makes sense, right? And I was kind of when we've been having this chat, I've been thinking that my mum always puts the washing machine on before like 5 a.m. or whatever, before 5:30 because it's cheaper, right? So like I guess cloud providers they will do the same thing, right? Because there's a business incentive there. If the energy's cheaper, if I can run these jobs there, then yeah, it makes total sense, right? I was also
Mhm.
thinking as well. I don't know if there's anything kind of in this space at the moment for this, or if cloud providers do this, but I know I'm kind of thinking when I go and book a train now or a flight or whatever, it always says on my ticket or on the booking, whatever, that this is the amount of carbon that this flight's going to cost, right? Are going to put into the environment. And it's just, I guess, making the consumer aware that they're actually having an impact on the environment. Is there anything like, is there a way that cloud providers could express that information to me as a consumer of buying compute to be aware of the fact that I am using I am emitting carbon into the environment and sort of then providing an API for me to be more flexible with my workload to reduce my carbon emissions?
Yeah, so I mean, cloud providers can definitely do that if because they sometimes have their own like hourly matching, like let's say for example, Google, they have hourly matching data definitely. So yeah, my short answer is yes, they definitely have resources or data to do that, but it's hard to measure carbon in general, right? Like like which source of electricity is actually serving your VM? Like we never know, so.
Yeah, I guess it's hard to be that granular, right, on something like that because it is the pulling in energy from a kind of a host of places, right? I guess. But yeah, that's interesting. Cool. Yeah. So my next question is, where do we go next, or where do you go next, Tammy, from this work? What's next on your sort of research agenda for spatiotemporal workload shifting?
Yeah, so this paper in general talks about cloud data centers workload scheduling to harness low carbon intensity period or location from electricity grids, right? So it's cloud attending to the grid. However, like in the future, as the electricity grid integrate more solar and wind to lower the emissions, they will need more flexible solution to balance the electricity demand from data centers and the variations in their resource availability. So rather than adapting to how carbon emissions currently were in the grid, cloud platforms might have to be more effective in supporting the grid's variable operations so that the grid can incorporate more renewable energy. So maybe our future work will quantify the potential of cloud platforms in supporting grids increasing renewable penetration.
Yeah, for sure. That sounds a really interesting research direction for sure, Tammy. Cool. Yeah, I mean, we obviously when we do research and we always want to have impact, right? That's kind of, I guess, the goal to affect the real world, be that industry or just people's day to day lives. So I guess if I put this question to you, kind of, what impact do you think your work on spatiotemporal workload shifting kind of have? And yeah, how do you think as a software engineer, as a developer, I can like leverage these findings of your work in my day to day life?
Yeah, so we briefly touch upon this. So let's say for spatial shifting, right? If we want to go for that path, we need to be aware that there will be an under provisioning of resources in high carbon intensity regions and over provisioning in low carbon intensity regions, right? Like the Sweden example, like if
Mm.
everyone moved to Sweden, then the rest of the world is not doing anything. What this means is that for the low carbon regions, they should focus on utilizing idle capacity, but also balancing the stability aspect. So that we briefly touch upon that. And for high carbon intensity regions, they need to look at aspect of energy efficiency. So like what I just said, like dynamic voltage frequency scaling, DVFS. Yeah, also like spatial migration doesn't have to be just data center. It can happen through like edge. So that could be more advantage than just relying on the cloud because maybe you can exploit like local renewables. And for temporary shifting, we also need to think about how we can break down big tasks to small jobs so that we can exploit the low carbon period that doesn't happen during like throughout the day.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
I guess this must have been a really fun project to work on, Tammy. I mean, what was the sort of most surprising thing when you were doing this study? And yeah, what was the kind of the most interesting lesson? Right? What was the most surprising thing you learned while working on this topic?
yeah, I mean, during actually the one thing that I really like about like the most interesting I really like about this work is like when we started, carbon intensity is just like up and down traces, like a sine graph, right?
Mm.
Somewhat. So we thought like, yeah, we have a lot of regions. We have 123 regions. At some point, like the carbon intensity traces will like cross each other. So we were like, okay, so spatial migration, maybe it's like you really need a complex solution for this, like to harness every low point or what is the optimal migration policies, right? But it turns out that in an ideal world, an ideal case where every region has infinite capacity and every region can migrate to the other, like no GDPR, you just need to migrate once and you get most of the savings. So that was like, wow, it's that easy. Like, what?
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, you'd expect this big, complex sort of solution, and then it ends up being sort of, yeah, just move to Sweden on a Tuesday at lunchtime and then stay there because that's the best place, right?
Yes. So yeah, that was one of the things that I usually tell people like, yeah, in ideal world, you migrate to Sweden, but and you're done. So that's interesting.
That's awesome. Where did this sort of project and this sort of topic and this like research idea come from originally? Then, Tammy, what was the backstory of the paper? Really, how did it come about?
Yeah, so for a while, there are papers that focus on exploiting either spatial or temporal scheduling to reduce the workload carbon emissions, right? Like there's Wait a While, there's Emma Strobel's paper that migrate AI workload. And we noticed that the papers evaluated the work in a limited setting. So they usually pick a few regions or using a narrow set of workloads. So we just wonder what is the potential of the carbon aware scheduling for in a large scale, like for the whole world and over a long period of time, right? Like 3 years from 2020 to 2022. So that is how this paper came about. Like you just want to see what is the big picture of the whole world instead of a few regions or just one particular workload.
Yeah, nice taking this sort of holistic view of it, and that's really awesome. As a nice segue from what we've just been talking about there, and talking about ideas and where where kind of things originate from, is like how do you personally approach generating ideas? And then once you've sort of, I mean, I have thousands of terrible ideas every day, right? How do you then choose which ones are actually worth pursuing and dedicating a significant portion of your time to working on?
Yeah, so reading a lot of papers as as any PhD students is expected to do. So so yeah, when you read so reading other interesting papers help a lot. So, and ask the question along the way, like, why did they do this particular experiment, this particular evaluation, or this particular setup? Why not the other way around? And yeah, like how this paper came about is the same thing. Like instead of picking 4 regions, why not 10? Why not 100? So just read a lot, ask a lot. So
No, I think that's really such advice. Yeah, challenge assumptions. I like that when you come across something like, why did they do it this way? Maybe if we did it different, like what would happen then? So yeah, I think that's definitely a good way to approach the creative process. Cool, Tammy. Well, we've arrived at the time for the last word now. And so yeah, what's the one takeaway you want the listeners to get from this podcast episode today?
we're ending. I don't want to go. Just kidding. So at the current state of the world, carbon-aware spatiotemporal workload shifting is likely not a panacea for significantly reducing cloud platforms' carbon emissions. But I think if researchers and industry work together with the goal of reducing carbon emissions in different layer of computer systems, I think we can come up with new ideas to reduce carbon emissions. And with that complement this temporal and spatial shifting. Yeah.
Awesome.
So that's my take.
Oh, that's great, Tammy. There's a call to action for everyone in industry and everyone in research. We need to work together to solve this problem. So yeah, that's the mission of the podcast as well. So we're bridging that gap. So yeah, everyone's been told now. Excellent stuff, Tammy. Thank you very much for talking to us today. It's been a fascinating chat, and I'm sure the listener will have really enjoyed it. We'll put links to all of the relevant materials in the show notes as well. And where can we find you on social media? Are you on LinkedIn, Twitter? Where can we find you?
Yeah, so LinkedIn would work. So Thorn Sukprasert, my first and last name, or T Sukprasert.
Cool.
You find me there. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, we'll put that up as well in the show notes so everyone can connect with you and reach out if they wish so. And yeah, we'll see you all next time for some more awesome computer science research.